You know, there is something rather peculiar happening in the human experience right now, and most people feel it in their bones, but very few have the courage to name it. It is a discomfort, a disturbance. When a person becomes genuinely authentic, when they begin to live from their own center rather than from the expectations of others, when they stop performing and start being, something unexpected occurs. The people around them do not simply celebrate this transformation. Instead, they begin to feel uncomfortable. Not always, not with everyone, but often enough that the authentic person notices it unmistakably. They sense it in the room. They feel it in conversations that suddenly become strained. They might not be told directly. There are rarely confrontations or honest conversations about what is actually happening. Instead, it comes out in subtle ways that are all the more damaging for their subtlety. A certain coldness, an edge to conversations that wasn't there before, jokes that land wrong. The person becomes labeled as difficult, problematic, intense, too much. They might be called selfish for having boundaries. They might be called arrogant for not seeking approval. They might be called unstable or unhappy or going through something. The narratives emerge. The stories are told about them. And here is what most people misunderstand about this phenomenon. When this happens, the person usually turns inward and begins to doubt themselves. They think they are being rejected because something is wrong with them. They think their authenticity is somehow offensive or off-putting or threatening in the way it should not be. They think maybe they should dial it back. Maybe they are being too real. Maybe they need to soften themselves. But I want to suggest to you that this is completely backwards. This interpretation is exactly backwards. The resentment they encounter, the quiet hostility, the distance that opens up between them and others like a chasm that grows wider every day, these things have very little to do with the authentic person at all. Instead, they have everything to do with what authenticity reveals in the person who encounters it. Your authenticity holds up a mirror to their inauthenticity. Your freedom makes their cage visible. Your truth makes their lies undeniable. And this is what they cannot forgive you for. Let me explain what I mean by walking you through 4 reasons why being too real, too genuine, too awake to yourself, truly coming home to who you actually are, will cause others to secretly hate you. Reason 1, you make others face their own masks. When you become authentically yourself, when you stop performing and pretending and wearing the careful masks that society has taught you to wear from childhood, you become something rather extraordinary and rather terrible all at once. You become a mirror, not an ordinary mirror that simply reflects back what people see, but a deeper mirror that reflects back who they actually are beneath their own carefully constructed facades. And this is profoundly threatening to most people, genuinely threatening. You see, we have all built an intricate system of pretense around ourselves. We have learned to smile when we do not feel like smiling. We have learned to say yes when every part of us screams no. We have learned to hide our doubts and our fears and our desires and our confusion behind a polished exterior that we present to the world with such conviction that no one would ever know it was a costume at all. This is not necessarily evil. In fact, to some degree, this is necessary for social functioning. I understand that. Without some masks, civilization itself would collapse. We need some level of social adaptation. But here is what happens over time when the mask stays on too long. Most people become so identified with their own mask that they forget entirely that there is a face beneath it. The mask becomes the only reality they know. The performance becomes the self. They genuinely believe that the person they are pretending to be is the person they actually are. There is no separation anymore. There is no memory of who they were before they put on the mask. This is a kind of possession without knowing you are possessed, a haunting by your own construction. They wake up one day and they cannot remember what they actually wanted. They cannot access their own desires. They have forgotten what their own voice sounds like when it is not filtered through the mask, and by the time they feel the weight of it, it is often too late. The mask has become the only version of themselves they can access. But then someone comes along who is not playing the game anymore. Someone who has seen through the masks and decided not to wear them. Someone who speaks about what is true rather than what is polite, even when honesty is uncomfortable. Someone who acts on their own values rather than on the expectations of the group, even when it costs them something. Someone who has decided that the cost of the mask is higher than the cost of being themselves. And suddenly, the people around this authentic person are forced, whether they want to be or not, to confront the reality of the mask they are wearing. They cannot unsee what they have seen. Your authenticity becomes an accusation against their performance. Not because you say anything directly, not because you judge them in any way or point out how false they are. Simply by being yourself, by existing in your truth, by speaking what is real to you, you force others to see themselves. You become a mirror they cannot turn away from. You become a living question mark over everything they have constructed. You remind them that they are choosing the mask every single day and that they could choose something different. I knew a woman once who began this process of radical honesty. She had spent decades being the person everyone wanted her to be, the supportive friend who could never have needs of her own, who was always available, always ready to help, never asking for anything in return, the agreeable colleague who never expressed an opinion that might rock the boat, who went along with every meeting, every decision, every direction the leadership chose to take. The dutiful daughter who sacrificed her own needs for family harmony, who came home and helped with the housework without asking, who never complained, who swallowed her frustrations to keep the peace. She had played these roles with such skill and for so long that she had almost forgotten they were roles. She thought this was who she actually was. But at a certain point, something shifted inside her, something that could not be ignored. She began to recognize the performance for what it was. She felt the mask becoming heavier. She noticed the numbness in her chest. She realized she did not actually know what she wanted anymore because she had spent so long wanting what others wanted. And she decided to stop. She made a decision. She began to speak about what was true for her. She began to say no when she did not want to do something, even though it made others uncomfortable, even though it meant disappointing people, even though it meant being seen as ungrateful. She began to express her own opinions rather than echoing the opinions of others in order to fit in. She began to take up space, to claim her own time and her own energy. And do you know what happened? The people who had loved her for her compliance suddenly found her intolerable. They said she had changed. They said she had become selfish and ungrateful and difficult. They said she used to be so much easier to be around. They organized against her. They subtly withdrew. They complained about her to mutual friends. But what had actually changed? Only her willingness to pretend anymore. Only her refusal to keep wearing the costume. Her mask had fallen away, and what they were seeing was a self they did not want to see because it made their own masks unbearable to look at. Their own compromises became visible to them. Their own unfreedom became visible. All the times they had swallowed what they actually felt. All the times they had performed agreeableness when they felt something else. All of it became visible. When you are authentically yourself, you cannot help but make others face the reality of their own masks. And most people do not want to face that reality. They would rather you put your mask back on so that they can comfortably put theirs back on too. They want the conspiracy to continue. They want everyone to pretend together because the pretending is easier than the truth. Because when you are real and they are not, it becomes painfully obvious that they are not real. This is why authentic people are so often met with resentment. It is not because something is wrong with you. It is because something is true about you, and that truth is troubling to those who have lost touch with truth in themselves. Reason 2, you threaten the collective agreement. Now, there is something deeper happening here that has to do with what we might call the collective agreement. Human society functions on a kind of invisible contract, an agreement that almost no one consciously agreed to, but everyone participates in nonetheless. Everyone agrees to play their part. Everyone agrees to pretend certain things are true even when they know they are not. Everyone agrees to value certain things and dismiss other things. Everyone agrees to care about what the collective has decided is important, and to pretend not to care about what the collective has decided is frivolous. The collective agreement is necessary for social order. I understand this deeply. Without it, we would have chaos. But what happens is that over time, most people completely forget that it is an agreement. They begin to believe that the collective values are actually their own values. They think the collective truths are actually true. They think the collective game is actually real. They think this is how the world actually works, not how we have all agreed it should work. This is where the real power of the collective lies. It is not in its ability to force conformity through violence or obvious coercion. Any tyrant can use force, but the collective is far more subtle and far more powerful. It is in its ability to become invisible, to disguise itself as truth and nature and inevitability. It becomes the water in which we swim. It becomes the air we breathe. No one questions it because no one even sees it. But then someone wakes up. Someone begins to see the invisible. Someone recognizes the collective agreement for what it is, not as truth but as a social arrangement, not as inevitable but as chosen, not as reality but as a shared fiction that we have all agreed to maintain, often without even knowing we agreed to it. And that person steps out of the agreement. They stop pretending to believe what the collective has decided they should believe. They stop caring about what the collective has decided is important and what it has decided is frivolous. They stop playing the collective game. They refuse to participate in the charade. They begin asking the questions that are not supposed to be asked. They begin to point out the contradictions that everyone is supposed to ignore. They begin to live according to their own truth rather than according to the collective truth. And this is when the real hostility emerges. Not gentle disagreement, not intellectual debate, not a conversation about different perspectives. Real, palpable hostility, a coldness, a withdrawal, sometimes overt anger. Because a person who has stepped out of the collective agreement threatens the entire structure in a very fundamental way. The entire system depends on everyone continuing to pretend. The whole agreement only works through collective participation and collective silence. If even one person can see that the emperor has no clothes, then others might begin to see it too. If even one person can step out of the game, then others might realize they can step out as well. If even one person can stop pretending, then the agreement begins to unravel. The story starts to crack. The shared reality begins to lose its power. This is terrifying to those who are still inside the agreement. because their entire sense of reality, their entire identity, their entire way of being in the world is built on the collective agreement being true and inevitable and unchangeable. They have built their lives on this foundation. If the foundation is not solid, if the agreement is not real, then what are they? When someone refuses to play anymore, it is not experienced as that person making a personal choice. It is not experienced as a difference of opinion. It is experienced as an assault on reality itself. It is experienced as a threat to the foundations of existence. It feels dangerous. I once observed a man in a corporate environment who began to refuse the unspoken rules that governed his workplace. These rules were never written down. No one ever taught them to him explicitly, but everyone knew them. He stopped pretending to be busy when he had finished his work. He stopped filling his day with meaningless tasks just to look productive. He stopped performing enthusiasm for projects that he thought were fundamentally meaningless. He stopped participating in the social hierarchies and the political games that everyone else was playing. He stopped talking behind people's backs. He stopped pretending to care about things he did not care about. He started being honest in meetings when the consensus was going in a direction he thought was wrong. And the response was swift and severe, very severe, not through any official channels. You will notice there were no formal reprimands, no documented complaints, not through direct confrontation or honest conversation where they could discuss what was actually happening. Instead, the response came through a kind of systematic ostracism, a slow freezing out. He was no longer invited to the informal gatherings where decisions were really made. He was overlooked for opportunities that would have been his based on his skills and seniority. His work, which had been praised before, was suddenly scrutinized and criticized with a particular venom. His reputation began to shift. People started saying things about him in hallways and in emails and in private conversations. He became unreliable, difficult, not a team player, not someone you could trust. Why? Because he had done something unbearable. He had refused the collective agreement. He had stepped out of the game, and everyone else felt it in their bones. They felt the ground shifting beneath them. They felt their own unconscious choices suddenly become visible, and therefore harder to justify. If he could refuse to play, then maybe they could too. If he could see through the game, then maybe they could see through it as well. If he could resist the collective, then maybe they did not have to do this anymore either. But they were not ready to do that. Most people are not ready. So instead, the collective had to protect itself. The collective agreement must be maintained at all costs, and the person who threatens it must be removed or neutralized or brought back into line. This is not conscious malice on anyone's part. It is not evil. It is automatic defense. It is the immune system of the collective responding to what it perceives as a threat, the body attacking the infection. This is how systems protect themselves. Reason 3. You expose the shadow they're hiding. When you become authentically yourself, you do something far more dangerous than most people realize. You expose the shadow that everyone around you has been hiding, not through words or accusations, but simply through your existence. Now, I mean shadow in a very specific sense, and this is important. The shadow is not evil. This is a key misunderstanding. The shadow is simply all of the parts of ourselves that we cannot bear to look at. The parts that do not fit with the image we have of ourselves or that we have been taught we must not have. The parts that are selfish or petty or weak or afraid or envious or cowardly or ambitious or hungry for power. The parts that contradict our carefully constructed self-image, the parts that make us uncomfortable when we think about them, the parts we have been told are not acceptable. We do not eliminate these parts by refusing to look at them. This is a common misconception that keeps people trapped. They do not simply vanish when we ignore them. They do not go away when we suppress them. Instead, they go underground. They become unconscious. They are repressed into the depths of the psyche, where they operate out of our awareness, and they influence our behavior in ways we do not understand and cannot control. We are driven by forces we cannot name. We find ourselves acting in ways that surprise us. We do things that seem out of character, and we cannot understand why we did them. We repeat patterns we swore we would never repeat. We find ourselves becoming the thing we most despised in our parents. This is the shadow at work. This is the unconscious running the show. But here is the key point that most people do not understand. When you become genuinely authentic, when you begin to acknowledge your own shadow and integrate it into a more complete self, when you stop pretending you do not have these parts and instead welcome them home and acknowledge them, you become a living reminder of everyone else's shadow. You become a walking proof that it is possible to look at yourself honestly and not fall apart. Your willingness to see what is true about yourself becomes an implicit accusation against their refusal to see what is true about themselves. You become a mirror they did not ask for. A person who has genuinely accepted their own selfishness, their own capacity for self-interest, becomes a mirror for the selfish impulses that others are trying frantically to deny in themselves. They say they are all selfless, all giving, all about others. But your authenticity, your permission to take up space and honor your own needs, reminds them that they too have selfish desires, that they have learned to hate in themselves. A person who has genuinely acknowledged their own fear, who has sat with their terror and made friends with it rather than running from it or pretending it is not there, becomes a reminder of the fear that others are trying desperately to hide behind a facade of competence and control. A person who has genuinely accepted their own weakness, their own limitations, their own humanity and fallibility, becomes a reflection of the weakness that others are desperately trying to conceal beneath layers of achievement and performance. And all of this happens without any words being spoken. All of this happens simply through your presence. You do not need to judge anyone or point out their shadow. You do not need to tell them how repressed they are or how much they are hiding from themselves. Your shadow work does it for you. Your willingness to be imperfect speaks louder than any criticism. Your authenticity becomes an implicit accusation. Your freedom becomes an indictment of their imprisonment. And people do not forgive accusers, conscious or unconscious. They may not even be aware that they are resenting you for something you did not do and did not intend, but the resentment is there. It is real. I once knew a woman who had done deep work on her own insecurity and her own need for approval. She had spent years facing her own feelings of inadequacy, her own fear of not being good enough, her own desperate hunger for validation. She had sat with all of this. She had looked at it directly. Through this work, she had become genuinely secure in herself. Not arrogant, not superior, but genuinely secure. She did not need others to confirm her worth. She did not need their praise or their approval or their attention. She could be nobody and feel fine about it. And what was the result? The people around her became hostile, not toward her specifically, but hostile in her presence, because her security was unbearable to them. It was a living reminder of their own insecurity, Her freedom from the need for approval was an indictment of their slavery to it. She had faced her shadow and integrated it and become whole. And in doing so, she had become someone very difficult to be around, at least for those who had not done the same work. They could not help but resent her, because she was no longer playing the game of seeking validation. She had stopped begging silently for approval, and this made everyone else's begging seem pathetic by comparison. This made their own compromises and selling out seem unnecessary. This made their own self-abandonment seem like a choice they were making rather than something that was happening to them. Reason 4. You don't play the status game. The fourth reason people secretly hate you when you become authentically yourself is perhaps the most subtle and yet the most profound. You do not play the status game. The status game is the game that almost everyone plays without even realizing they are playing it. It is the game of positioning yourself higher than others, of measuring your worth in comparison to everyone around you, of collecting achievements and possessions and credentials and relationships that signal your value to the world. It is the game of constantly keeping score, of measuring yourself against others and trying to come out on top, of winning. This game is so fundamental to how human beings organize themselves that we forget it is a game at all. We think it is reality. We think that status is real, and that achievement is real, and that power and prestige are real. We think these things actually mean something. But it is all just a game we have collectively agreed to play. A game with rules everyone knows, but no one acknowledges. A game where everyone is pretending it is not a game. When you become authentically yourself, when you begin to live from your center rather than from the external validation of others, you step out of this game. This does not mean you become a failure, or that you live poorly, or that you stop accomplishing things. You can have success and still not be playing the status game, but you stop accumulating achievements because you need them to prove your worth to yourself and others. You stop positioning yourself higher than others because you no longer need to feel superior in order to feel okay about yourself. You stop keeping score because you realize that the score means nothing at all in any ultimate sense. You work when work is meaningful to you. You rest when rest is what you need. You build when building calls to you. You create when creation flows. You take up space or you stay quiet, depending on what feels true in the moment. And this is deeply threatening to everyone who is still playing the game, deeply, profoundly, because the game only works if everyone plays. It only has meaning if everyone believes in its importance and its inevitability. If everyone is competing for status, then status is real and the competition is meaningful. But if even one person can see that it is a game and can step out of it and can live perfectly well without playing, then everyone else is forced to confront the possibility that they too could step out, that they do not have to keep climbing, that they do not have to keep proving themselves endlessly, that they could rest, that their worth does not depend on their achievements. And most people do not want to contemplate that possibility because that possibility is terrifying. It challenges everything they have built their lives around. Moreover, the person who has stepped out of the status game becomes invisible in a particular way. You cannot compete with them. You cannot beat them in the game because they are not playing anymore. This makes them very hard to deal with. In the status game, there is always a way to gain an advantage. You can work harder, achieve more, become more impressive, say something sharper, make more money. There is always something you can do to get ahead. But what do you do with a person who does not care about being impressive? How do you compete with someone who has opted out? How do you beat someone who is not trying to win? You cannot. And this powerlessness in the face of someone who refuses to play the game creates a kind of rage in those who are still deep in the game. A rage that is often unconscious, but very real. A man I once encountered had spent his entire life climbing the ladder. He had focused every moment, every ounce of energy on achieving more, becoming more important, gaining more status and recognition. His whole identity was built on advancement and achievement. He could not rest. He could not enjoy what he had already accomplished because there was always more to achieve. And then he met someone who had simply decided that none of it mattered. This person was not poor or unsuccessful by ordinary measures. They had accomplished things, but they were not trying to be successful. They were not trying to be impressive or important or better than anyone else. They were simply living in alignment with what was meaningful to them and letting everything else go. They had a job that paid the bills. They had time for what mattered. They seemed content. And this drove the man absolutely crazy. He could not understand it. He could not figure out how to relate to someone who was not interested in the status game. He could not find a way to compete because there was nothing to compete about. He could not position himself above or below this person because the whole framework of comparison was meaningless to them. They were not competing, they were living. In his frustration and confusion, he began to speak badly of this person. He found fault, he criticized, he tried to diminish them in front of others. He questioned their integrity and their intelligence. He said they were lazy, unmotivated, not serious. Why? Because their freedom from the game was unbearable to him. It was a living contradiction of everything he had built his life around. It was a rebuke to all the sacrifices he had made, all those years of pushing, of striving, of putting aside what he actually enjoyed to do because it was not ambitious enough. Their authenticity, their refusal to play, had become a profound threat to the very foundation of how he understood himself and his life. These 4 reasons run very deep in human nature, very deep indeed. They are not about you being wrong or being too much or being too intense or needing to work on yourself. They are not a personal failing or a character flaw. They are about the fact that you have chosen to become real, and reality is fundamentally threatening to those who have built their lives on pretense and games and unconscious agreements. This is not something you can fix by being less authentic. You cannot win the resentment of people who are disturbed by your authenticity by becoming less real. The only way this resentment could diminish would be if you put your mask back on. If you stepped back into line with the collective agreement and agreed to pretend along with everyone else. If you became willing to hide your shadow again and pretend those parts of you do not exist. If you returned to playing the status game obsessively and started trying to prove your worth through achievement and accumulation and positioning. But to do this would be to betray yourself in the most fundamental way. It would be to go back to sleep after you have awakened to your own nature. It would be to return to the prison after tasting freedom. It would be to shrink back into the comfortable prison of pretense that you have already seen through. And I do not think you can unknow what you have come to know. I do not think you can unsee what you have come to see. Reason 5, you make people feel their own emptiness. So there is one more reason people harbor this secret resentment toward those who live authentically, and it is perhaps the most painful one. When you become genuinely yourself, when you stop performing and filling the void with constant noise and distraction and accomplishment, you reveal something unbearable about the human condition. You reveal the emptiness that is at the heart of so many lives. Most people spend their entire existence running from this emptiness. They fill their days with noise. They accumulate possessions and achievements and relationships and experiences, all in a desperate attempt to fill the void that they feel but do not dare to look at directly. They stay busy, they stay distracted, they keep moving, they keep chasing. The moment there is silence, the moment the noise stops, the moment they have nothing to do, the emptiness surfaces. It rises up like water filling a hole. And it is terrifying. It is so terrifying that most people have arranged their entire lives to prevent ever encountering this emptiness directly. They structure their days so that there is always something to do. They surround themselves with people so that there is never silence. They consume content, they engage in drama, they pursue projects, they work obsessively, all to keep the emptiness at bay. I have seen this pattern repeat itself countless times. People who cannot tolerate 15 minutes of solitude, people who wake up in the morning and immediately turn on the television or check their phone or start planning their day, anything to avoid the simple fact of being alone with themselves. People who have arranged their entire social lives around never being alone. People who stay in relationships they know are wrong, because the alternative is facing that emptiness. This is not random. This is not an accident. There is a deep psychological truth here. The void is real. There is an absence at the center of most people's lives, an absence of genuine contact with themselves, a profound disconnection from their own being. This is what happens when you spend most of your life looking outward instead of inward. When you spend most of your time adapting to what others need instead of tuning into what you actually are. This absence creates a kind of existential anxiety that lives just beneath the surface of consciousness. It is the reason so many people feel lonely even when surrounded by others. It is the reason so many people feel depressed for no identifiable reason. It is the reason so many people move through their days with a kind of quiet desperation. It is the reason so many people reach for something, always reaching, always grasping, never quite satisfied. The emptiness they are running from is not a symptom of pathology. It is not a sign of weakness or broken psychology. It is a symptom of being disconnected from yourself. It is the natural result of living inauthentically for long enough. But then someone comes along who has made friends with the emptiness. Someone who has sat with it, looked at it directly, and discovered that it is not actually emptiness at all. It is simply the absence of all the noise and the distraction and the performance. It is the space beneath the doing. And in that space, something alive begins to emerge. A presence, a realness. A capacity to simply be without needing to prove anything or accomplish anything or have anyone validate your existence. This person is no longer desperate. They no longer radiate that subtle anxiety that comes from the constant need to fill the void with something. They no longer seem to be reaching for something just beyond their grasp. They are simply present. They can sit in silence and not feel uncomfortable. They can be alone and not feel lonely. They do not fill space with meaningless words just to avoid the discomfort of quiet. They can do nothing and feel fine about it. They have discovered that being is enough, and this is absolutely intolerable to the people around them who have built their entire existence on the assumption that the void is unbearable and must be filled at all costs, because your presence is a constant, wordless reminder that they could do the same thing, that they do not have to keep running, that they could stop filling the void and simply sit with it, that they could discover what you have discovered, but they are not ready. Most people are not ready. The prospect of sitting with their own emptiness is far too frightening. So instead of doing that inner work, instead of facing their own emptiness, they resent you for doing yours. They resent you for having found a way to live with yourself that does not depend on constant external validation and constant stimulation and constant doing. Your peace becomes a judgment against their restlessness. Your ability to simply be becomes an accusation against their compulsive doing. They cannot afford to see what you have seen, because it would require them to change their entire way of life. It would require them to tolerate silence. It would require them to turn off the noise and sit with themselves and discover what is actually there beneath all the running and all the chasing. It would require them to face the void and discover that they can survive it, that they do not actually die when the doing stops. So they label you as lazy or unmotivated or depressed. They say you have given up or that something is wrong with you. They suggest that you need more structure in your life, or more ambition, or more engagement with the world. Anything to pull you back into the game of filling the void with constant distraction. Anything to avoid confronting the possibility that you have discovered something that makes their endless chasing seem pointless. They need you to keep chasing so that they can keep chasing. They need you to keep running so that their running does not seem quite so desperate. Reason 6, you won't enable their unconsciousness. There is another dimension to this resentment that runs very deep indeed. When you become authentic, when you begin to live from truth rather than from pretense, you become what I would call unreliable. You become someone who cannot be manipulated in the old ways. You cannot be guilt-tripped anymore because you have made peace with your own boundaries. You cannot be shamed anymore because you have faced your own shame and integrated it. You cannot be controlled through the threat of withdrawal or rejection anymore because you have learned to find your own center and your own validation. And most importantly, you will no longer enable other people's unconsciousness the way you did when you were performing. This is crucial. This is one of the deepest sources of resentment. When you were playing the game, when you were wearing the masks, you were a reliable participant in everyone else's denial. You confirmed their stories about themselves. You validated their self-deceptions. You participated in their unconscious games. You allowed them to project onto you. You took on roles that served their needs to see themselves in a particular way. You were useful to them in their unconsciousness. You made it possible for them to continue being asleep. You were, in a very real sense, complicit in the maintenance of their delusion. But now that you have awakened, now that you refuse to pretend, you can no longer be used this way. You will not validate someone's self-deception anymore. You will not pretend to believe their stories about themselves if those stories are false. You will not participate in their games of victim and savior or superior and inferior. You will not take on the roles they need you to take on so that they can continue their unconscious patterns. You will not agree with them when they are wrong simply to keep the peace. You will not stay silent when staying silent would be complicit. You simply will not do it anymore. And this is catastrophic to people who have been depending on you to serve this function. They lose a crucial tool. They lose someone who was helping them stay asleep. They lose a mirror that reflected back only what they wanted to see. When a person has been using you as a mirror for their self-deceptions, and you suddenly become a clear mirror that reflects what is actually true, the loss of your previous function becomes unbearable. It is like they have lost a part of their support system. I once knew a family where one person began the work of waking up. They had been the designated scapegoat for the family system. They were the one who was blamed for the family's problems. They were the one who was seen as the troubled one, the difficult one, the one who needed to change. They carried the family's projected shadow, and everyone else in the family had unconsciously organized themselves around this role. They could feel superior and righteous in relation to this person's supposed failings. They could deny their own problems by focusing on this person's problems. They had a shared enemy that united them, a shared project of trying to fix this person that gave them a sense of purpose and togetherness. There was a kind of perverse bonding that happened through their shared condemnation of this one family member. But then this person began to see through this dynamic. They began to recognize the pattern for what it was. They began to refuse the role. They stopped accepting the blame. They stopped performing being the problem. They began to speak about what was actually true from their perspective. They began to set boundaries around the blame and the guilt that was constantly being projected onto them. They stopped explaining themselves endlessly, as if more explanation would finally make the family understand. And the family responded with fury, absolute fury, rage, really. Not because this person had actually done anything wrong, not because they had harmed anyone in any way, but because they had stopped playing the role that the family needed them to play. They had stopped being useful to the family's denial. They had stopped enabling the family's unconsciousness. And the family could not afford to let that happen because their entire system, their entire sense of themselves depended on this person's continued participation in the dysfunctional pattern. When you stop enabling other people's unconsciousness, when you stop participating in their games and their denial and their self-deceptions, they will often interpret this as a betrayal. They will feel abandoned. They will feel like you have taken something away from them, which is exactly what has happened. You have taken away their tool for staying unconscious. You have removed a crucial mechanism that allowed them to avoid looking at themselves. You have become unreliable in the way that matters most to them. You will no longer confirm their distorted view of reality. You will no longer participate in the collective agreements that allow them to avoid the truth. You will no longer be the person they can blame or project onto or use to make themselves feel better about their own failings. And this is experienced as a loss that they will not easily forgive. This is experienced as a kind of death, a death of the relationship they thought they had. They will fight hard to pull you back into the role. They will try to make you feel guilty for abandoning them. They will suggest that you have become selfish or cold or unloving. They may try to recruit others to judge you as well. They may paint you as the villain in the story of your own liberation. But what is actually happening is that you have become real. You have stopped being useful to their unconsciousness. And this is unforgivable in their eyes because their entire system depends on a certain number of people remaining asleep and willing to play the games that keep everyone else asleep as well. Your wakefulness threatens the entire structure. Reason 7. You represent the path they are too afraid to take. Perhaps the deepest reason for the secret hatred that authentic people encounter is this. You represent a path that others know they could take but are too frightened to take. You are a living embodiment of a choice that everyone around you is aware exists but has chosen not to make. And your very existence becomes an indictment of that choice. This is not something they are doing consciously. There is no conspiracy, but it is felt in their bones. When you live authentically, when you have chosen your own truth over the collective agreement, when you have chosen freedom over comfort, you make it impossible for others to pretend that their choice to do the opposite was inevitable. You make it clear that it was a choice, that they could have chosen differently, that they are choosing differently right now, every single day, and the reason is fear. Fear of judgment, fear of loss, fear of abandonment, fear of not having approval, fear of standing alone, fear of being wrong, fear of not knowing who they are, if they stop performing the identity that was given to them. Fear of disappointing the people who have invested in their compliance. Your authenticity is a constant reminder of this choice. It is a constant reminder that there is another way to live. It is a constant reminder that freedom is possible but requires a price. And most people are not willing to pay that price. Most people would rather remain comfortable in their prison than face the terror of stepping out. They would rather have the devil they know than risk encountering the unknown. They have made peace with their chains. But your existence makes this choice harder to live with, because you have proven that it is possible to step out. You have proven that you can survive it. You have proven that you can be yourself and still have a life, still have relationships, still have meaning, even though everyone told them that was impossible. This is terrifying to people who have accepted the narrative that authenticity is not possible, that compromise is necessary, that you have to wear the mask to survive in society. Your existence contradicts this narrative. Your life contradicts their certainty, and contradictions are destabilizing. Contradictions force you to either update your beliefs or double down even harder on your defense of the old beliefs. When someone has built an entire life on the assumption that a particular thing is not possible, and then someone comes along and proves that it is possible, it creates what we might call cognitive dissonance, a tension between the belief they have held and the reality they are now confronted with. It is very uncomfortable. The mind does not like this kind of tension. And this tension must be resolved somehow. There are really only two ways to resolve it. One is to update your beliefs, to acknowledge that what you thought was impossible might actually be possible, to admit that perhaps you were wrong, to examine the choices you have made in light of this new information. But this is terrifying. This means looking at your own life and your own choices and asking yourself whether you made the right decision, whether your sacrifices were necessary, whether your compromises were worth it. So the easier path is the other one. The easier way is to somehow diminish the person who is contradicting your belief, to suggest that they are special or crazy or privileged or broken in some way that makes their path irrelevant to you, to find reasons why you cannot do what they are doing, to create exceptions that prove the rule remains unchanged, to dismiss them in some way so that you do not have to confront the possibility that you could have chosen as they have chosen. The resentment often comes wrapped up in what feels like care. They say things like, "I am worried about you. You are isolating yourself. You are going to end up alone. You are throwing away your future. You are being reckless. You are being selfish. You have changed. Are you sure you are okay?" But beneath this veneer of concern is often something else. Beneath it is the rage of someone who sees their own possibility reflected back at them and is too afraid to pursue it. So they attack the reflection instead. They attack you instead of updating their beliefs. I once knew a person who began to step away from a career that they had spent a decade building, but that made them deeply unhappy. Everyone said they were making a terrible mistake. Everyone said they would regret it. Everyone said they needed to think of their financial security and their status and their future prospects. Everyone said they were throwing away their life. But what was really happening is that this person's choice to leave was forcing everyone around them to confront the fact that they were staying in situations that made them unhappy for reasons of security and status and collective approval. This person's choice made it harder to pretend that they had no choice. It made it harder to believe the story that they were trapped. It made their own compromises visible and therefore harder to justify. And so the people around them fought hard to pull them back. They suggested they were being impulsive. They suggested they would regret it. They suggested they were in some kind of crisis They suggested they were having a breakdown. They painted dark pictures of what would happen to them if they left. Homelessness, poverty, failure, disgrace. But underneath all of this was a deeper panic. The panic of someone looking at a reflection of their own disowned possibility. The panic of someone seeing what their own freedom might look like if they were brave enough to pursue it. The panic of someone realizing that they could have made a different choice but did not, that they had simply chosen not to. And that realization was more than they could bear. Reason 8, you can't be controlled or manipulated. And finally, there is the matter of control. This is perhaps the most fundamental reason for the resentment. A person who is authentically themselves cannot be controlled in the usual ways. They cannot be threatened with loss of love because they know their love of themselves is not dependent on their performance. They cannot be shamed into obedience because they have made peace with their shadow and the parts of themselves they had learned to hate. They cannot be manipulated through appeals to their ego or their insecurity because they have faced both of these squarely and are no longer enslaved to them. They cannot be controlled through withholding of approval because they have learned to approve of themselves. This is perhaps the most destabilizing thing about an authentic person. They are free in a real sense, not a theoretical sense. Not just free in their mind, free in their actual behavior and their actual choices. And freedom is the one thing that cannot be controlled. It is the one thing that cannot be contained or leveraged or weaponized. You can control a person's behavior if they are dependent on external validation. You can control a person's choices if they care more about others' approval than their own truth. You can control a person's life if they are driven by fear and shame and the desperate need to be loved and to belong. But you cannot control a person who has learned to love and validate themselves. You cannot control a person who has made peace with standing alone. You cannot control a person who values truth more than comfort. Such a person is fundamentally unpredictable from the perspective of someone who has always used predictable leverage to manage relationships. They have become unmanageable. And so what happens is that the people who have been used to controlling you or to believing they have that right begin to experience your authenticity as insubordination, as a kind of rebellion, as a refusal to respect the hierarchy that was established in your relationship with them. A parent who used to be able to control their child through guilt or shame suddenly cannot. A partner who used to be able to control their spouse through manipulation or the threat of withdrawal suddenly cannot. A friend who used to be able to control you through social pressure or the withdrawal of their approval suddenly cannot. A boss who used to be able to control you through career advancement or the threat of firing suddenly finds you no longer care about climbing the ladder or proving yourself. The entire system collapses. The leverage that worked for years suddenly has no effect, and the loss of this control is experienced as a profound betrayal. It is experienced as a loss of power. It is experienced as a diminishment of their place in your life. It is experienced as rejection because in many relationships, perhaps most relationships, when you look closely, the sense of intimacy or connection is actually built on a dynamic of control. One person controlling through various means and the other person being controlled. This is not always obvious. It is often disguised as love or concern or closeness. But when you begin to extract yourself from this dynamic, when you begin to no longer be controllable, people often experience it as a withdrawal of love rather than as a reclamation of your own autonomy. They interpret your freedom as rejection of them specifically. An authentic person is someone who can be trusted with freedom, someone who does not need to be managed or guided or corrected, someone who can be left to their own devices and will not spin out or fall apart or make destructive choices. This is deeply threatening to people who have organized their sense of purpose around being needed. People who have built their identity around being the one who helps or guides or manages or rescues. People who have found meaning in the role of savior, teacher, leader, expert. The authentic person no longer needs rescuing. This person no longer needs guidance. This person is no longer a project that requires management and direction. This person is simply a person. And for people who have built their entire sense of self-worth around being needed, around having someone to manage or fix or be responsible for, this loss of usefulness is truly devastating. It is a kind of existential crisis. Who am I if I am not needed? Who am I if this person no longer depends on me? The authentic person has become a peer, an equal, someone who cannot be positioned below them or in need of their superior knowledge or superior moral position. And this is profoundly destabilizing to the entire relational dynamic. It changes everything. So, about how the relationship can function, concluding synthesis, the price and power of being real. So here we have the complete picture. 8 reasons why people secretly hate those who have chosen to be authentically themselves. 8 reasons rooted not in any flaw in the authentic person, but in the very nature of what authenticity reveals and requires in those who encounter it. These are not 8 isolated phenomena. They are 8 aspects of the same fundamental threat that an authentic person represents to an unconscious system. When you live authentically, you are not simply making a personal choice. You are making a choice that has profound ripple effects through everyone around you. You are holding up mirrors they did not ask for and do not want to look into. You are reminding them of agreements they have forgotten they are making, agreements they thought were unchangeable and inevitable. You are showing them the cage they have built with their own hands, the masks they are wearing by their own choice, the price they are paying for their participation in collective unconsciousness. You are representing a freedom they are afraid of, because freedom means responsibility. Freedom means no one to blame. You are demonstrating that control and manipulation do not work against someone who has learned to be at home with themselves. And all of this is deeply unsettling to the people who have invested their entire lives in the opposite direction. But here is what I want to say to you, and I want you to hear this very clearly because it is important. This resentment that you encounter, this subtle hostility, this cold distance, this quiet hatred that sometimes emerges from the people around you, it is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is not a sign that you need to dial it back or soften your edges or try harder to fit in. It is not a sign that you need to perform better or explain yourself more thoroughly or be more grateful for their concerns. It is actually a sign that you are doing something profoundly right. It is a sign that your authenticity is real and not merely performative. It is a sign that you have actually stepped out of the game rather than simply repositioning yourself within it. It is a sign that you are genuinely awake rather than simply pretending to be awake while maintaining the same structures. The resentment is the price of freedom. It is the price you pay for refusing to participate in collective denial. It is the price you pay for holding others accountable silently and simply by existing to the possibility of their own awakening. It is the toll that authenticity exacts from a world built on pretense. Most people will not pay this price. Most people will see the cost and choose to put their mask back on. They will choose comfort and belonging over truth and authenticity. This is not a failure on their part. This is not a moral failing. This is simply a choice that people make based on their capacity for risk and their ability to tolerate uncertainty. Some people are not ready to wake up. Some people are not ready to step out of the game. Some people are not ready to face what lies beneath the performance. And you cannot make them ready. You cannot force them to see what they are not ready to see. You cannot drag them toward authenticity. You cannot shame them into waking up. All you can do is live your own awakeness. But you can live authentically yourself. You can stand in your own truth. You can refuse to participate in the games that are no longer real for you. You can make the choice they are not yet ready to make. And in doing so, you become a living testimony to the possibility of another way, not through preaching or evangelizing or trying to convince anyone, simply through your presence, simply through your refusal to pretend, simply through your willingness to be yourself even when it costs you something. And that is enough. That is everything. Because one authentic person in a room full of performance has more power than all the noise and all the pretense combined. Your presence is revolutionary. Your authenticity is an act of rebellion against the systems that require unconsciousness to function. Your refusal to participate changes the frequency of the entire room. And yes, this will generate resentment. This will generate hatred. You should not be naive about this. The systems of control will fight back. Those who benefit from your compliance will resist your freedom. But it will also, if you are patient, if you are strong, eventually generate change. Because consciousness spreads, authenticity spreads, freedom spreads. But only through the real people who have the courage to be real in a world that desperately wants them to stay asleep. You are not alone in this. There are others like you. Others who have seen through the game and stepped out. Others who are paying the price of their own authenticity. And together, not through organization or effort, but simply through your collective refusal to pretend, you are quietly changing the world from the inside out.